United States Capitol, Washington, D.C., March 26, 1964, 12:47 p.m. Malcolm X stood in the Senate gallery watching the debate on the Civil Rights Act. He'd come to observe, to understand how the machinery of American power functioned when it pretended to care about black people. The gallery was packed with civil rights leaders, activists, journalists, and curious citizens. Malcolm sat near the back, arms crossed, face impassive, watching white senators argue about whether black Americans deserved basic human rights. He'd flown in from New York that morning. He had no official role in the proceedings. He was just there, watching, judging. Then someone whispered his name. Malcolm turned. A photographer was gesturing frantically toward the hallway. Something was happening. Malcolm stood and walked out of the gallery into the marble corridor outside. That's when he saw him, Martin Luther King Jr., walking toward him from the opposite end of the hall. MLK had just finished testifying before the Senate Commerce Committee. He was surrounded by aides, advisors, reporters, but when he saw Malcolm, everyone else seemed to disappear. The two men walked toward each other. America's most famous civil rights leader and America's most controversial black radical. The prophet of nonviolence and the advocate of self-defense by any means necessary. They'd never met before, never spoken, never been in the same room. They existed in opposing orbits, representing fundamentally different answers to the same question: how do black people achieve freedom in a country built on their oppression? The hallway was crowded. Photographers sensed something historic and raised their cameras. The two men stopped maybe 3 feet apart, and then they spoke for 60 seconds, maybe 90. The exact length is disputed, but everyone who was there agreed it was brief, quiet, intense, and when it was over, neither man ever told anyone what they said, not their wives, not their closest advisors, not the historians who later begged for details. The conversation went to the grave with both of them. This is the story of that 60 seconds. And the mystery that haunts American history. To understand why that meeting mattered, you have to understand how different Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. were. In 1964, MLK was the face of the civil rights movement, Nobel Peace Prize nominee, leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the man who'd led the Montgomery bus boycott, survived the Birmingham campaign. Delivered "I Have a Dream" at the March on Washington. He preached nonviolent resistance, turning the other cheek, appealing to white America's conscience, integrating into American society as equals. MLK believed the moral arc of the universe bent toward justice. That patient, persistent, peaceful protest would eventually break the back of segregation. That love was more powerful than hate, and his strategy was working. The Civil Rights Act was about to pass. Public opinion was shifting. The movement had momentum. MLK represented hope, the belief that America could be redeemed, that black and white could live together in harmony, that the dream was possible. Malcolm X represented something else entirely. He was the national spokesman for the Nation of Islam until he'd left the organization just 3 weeks before this meeting. He preached black nationalism, self-defense, separation, not integration. He called white people devils, called nonviolence foolish, said black people should defend themselves by any means necessary, mocked MLK's dream as a nightmare. Malcolm believed America was irredeemable, that integration was a trap, that black people needed their own nation, their own economy, their own power, that begging white people for rights was undignified, that freedom wasn't given, it was taken. The media loved pitting them against each other. MLK the good Negro, Malcolm the dangerous one. MLK the Christian, Malcolm the Muslim. MLK the integrationist, Malcolm the separatist. But the reality was more complicated. By March 1964, both men were evolving. MLK was becoming more radical. The violence in Birmingham, the bombing that killed 4 little girls, the assassination of Medgar Evers, it was hardening him. He was starting to talk about economic justice, about systemic poverty, about the limits of legal equality without economic power. He was starting to sound a little like Malcolm, and Malcolm was becoming more open. He just left the Nation of Islam after discovering Elijah Muhammad's moral failings. He'd gone to Mecca, experienced Orthodox Islam, seen Muslims of all races praying together as equals. He was starting to believe that not all white people were devils, that coalitions were possible, that the struggle was global, not just American. He was starting to sound a little like Martin. Neither man had said this publicly yet, but they were thinking it, and maybe that's what made the meeting possible. Not agreement, but movement, both toward a middle ground neither had. Inhabited before, the meeting almost didn't happen. Malcolm wasn't supposed to be at the Capitol that day. He planned to be in New York working on his new organizations, Muslim Mosque, Inc., and the Organization of Afro-American Unity, but a reporter had called him the night before, told him MLK was testifying, asked if he had a comment. Malcolm said he wanted to see it for himself. So he booked a last-minute flight, showed up unannounced, and sat in the gallery like any other citizen. MLK didn't know Malcolm was there until after his testimony. He was walking through the Senate hallway, surrounded by people, when someone told him, "Malcolm X is here. He's in the building." MLK stopped. His advisors immediately tensed. They'd spent years distancing MLK from Malcolm, telling the press they were different, that MLK didn't support. Malcolm's methods, that violence and nonviolence couldn't coexist in the same movement. The last thing they wanted was a photograph of the two together. But MLK didn't avoid Malcolm. He asked where he was. Someone pointed down the hallway, and MLK walked toward him. Not quickly, not slowly, just deliberately, like a man who'd been thinking about this meeting for years and suddenly realized it was about to happen. Malcolm saw him coming, stood up straighter. Relaxed his arms. Malcolm was taller than MLK, 6 feet to MLK's 5'8". Malcolm was leaner, sharper-featured, wore glasses that made him look intellectual and intense. MLK was stockier, rounder-faced, had a warmth Malcolm didn't project. They looked like opposites. They were opposites. But when they met in that hallway, something unexpected happened. They smiled. Not fake political smiles, real ones, the kind you give someone you've been curious about for a long time. The kind that says, "I see you. I know who you are. I respect what you're trying to do even if I don't agree with how you're doing it." The photographers rushed forward, cameras clicking. This was the shot. The two titans of Black America face to face for the first time. The image would become iconic. Malcolm and Martin, both in dark suits, both with that slightly amused look people get when they realize history is being made. "Dr. King, I've been wanting to meet you," Malcolm said. "Mr. Malcolm, the pleasure is mine," Martin replied. And then they stepped to the side, away from the crowd, into a quieter corner of the hallway, and they talked. No one knows exactly what they said. The few people close enough to hear. Caught fragments, phrases, but not the full conversation. One aide remembered hearing Malcolm say something about the same goal, different methods. Another remembered MLK mentioning unity in the struggle. A photographer recalled both men laughing at one point, but the substance, the real exchange, was private. Intentionally so, both men positioned themselves so their backs were to the crowd. They leaned in close, they spoke quietly. It was deliberate privacy in a public space. A conversation meant to be seen but not heard, and when it was over, after maybe 60 seconds, they shook hands again. The photographers got that shot too. A firm handshake, direct eye contact, mutual respect visible in their postures. Then MLK walked one direction, Malcolm walked the other, and that was it, the only time they ever met. Only conversation they ever had, and neither one ever explained what they discussed. Reporters immediately asked both men what they'd talked about. Malcolm was characteristically evasive. "We had a nice conversation, private, between two men trying to help our people." MLK was similarly vague. "We greeted each other, exchanged pleasantries, wished each other well in our respective work." The press pushed harder. Was there disagreement? Were they planning to work together? Had they found common ground? Malcolm deflected. "I respect Dr. King's work. We have different approaches. That's all I'll say." MLK deflected too. "Mr. Malcolm and I served different roles in the movement. Our meeting was cordial. That's sufficient." Both men were protecting something, but what? Over the years, people close to both leaders tried to get them to open up. Coretta Scott King, MLK wife, asked him about it. He smiled and said, "Some conversations are just between the men who have them." Betty Shabazz, Malcolm's wife, asked him. He said, "Martin and I understood each other. That's all that matters." Malcolm's biographers pressed him. He gave them nothing. MLK advisors tried. He changed the subject. It was as if both men had made a pact. "This stays between us, forever." Why the secrecy? One theory, they disagreed so fundamentally that revealing the conversation would damage both their public images. If Malcolm had tried to convince MLK that nonviolence was foolish, MLK couldn't admit that without looking defensive. If MLK had tried to convince Malcolm that self-defense rhetoric was hurting the movement, Malcolm couldn't admit that without looking weak. Silence protected both. Another theory, they agreed on more than either could publicly admit. By 1964, MLK was privately frustrated with white liberals who supported civil rights in theory but opposed every tactic that inconvenienced them. Malcolm was starting to think coalitions with white activists might be useful. Maybe in that 60 seconds, they admitted things to each other they couldn't admit to anyone else. A third theory, the conversation was meaningless small talk, and the secrecy was strategic, mystery kept people interested. But this doesn't explain the intensity witnesses describe. It wasn't small talk, it mattered, we just don't know what. What we do know is what happened after. Malcolm X was assassinated on February 21, 1965, less than a year after meeting MLK. He was shot 16 times while giving a speech at the Audubon Ballroom in New York. 3 men from the Nation of Islam were convicted, though questions about FBI involvement remain. Malcolm was 39 years old. He never got to build the movement he was imagining, never got to fully articulate his evolving philosophy, never got to work with MLK if that was something they'd discussed. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on April 4, 1968, 4 years after meeting Malcolm. He was shot once while standing on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. James Earl Ray was convicted, though conspiracy theories persist. MLK was 39 years old. He never got to finish the Poor People's Campaign, never got to fully challenge American imperialism and economic injustice the way he was beginning to, never got to reunite with Malcolm if that was something they'd wanted. Both men were killed by bullets, both at 39, both before their work was complete, and both took the content of that 60-second conversation to their graves. Coretta Scott King spoke about the meeting once, years after Martin's death. She said, "Martin told me that meeting Malcolm changed something for him, not his methods, but his understanding of the rage that drives people to different methods. He said Malcolm helped him see that nonviolence and self-defense weren't opposites. They were different responses to the same oppression, and both were valid." Betty Shabazz said something similar in an interview in the 1990s. "Malcolm respected Dr. King more than people knew. He told me King had courage Malcolm didn't think nonviolent people could have. To face dogs and fire hoses without fighting back, Malcolm said that took a different kind of strength. He admired it even if he couldn't do it himself." These second-hand accounts are all we have, fragments, interpretations, but they suggest something profound happened in that hallway. Not agreement, not alliance, but recognition. 2 men who represented different paths, acknowledging that both paths required courage. Both paths faced the same enemy, and maybe, just maybe, both paths could coexist in the same movement. The photograph from that day is famous now. You've probably seen it, Malcolm and Martin standing close, smiling, shaking hands. It's been used on t-shirts, posters, book covers. It's become a symbol of Black unity, of different leaders finding common ground. But that's projection. We see what we want to see. The photo doesn't tell us what they said. It doesn't reveal the content of the conversation. It just shows 2 men who respected each other enough to meet, to talk, to acknowledge each other's existence in a public space. And that in 1964 America was radical enough because the system wanted them divided, wanted nonviolence and self-defense to be mutually exclusive, wanted integration and nationalism to be irreconcilable, wanted Black America to pick a lane and stay in it. The photo proved something the system didn't want to admit. Different strategies could coexist. Different leaders could respect each other. Unity didn't require uniformity, and maybe that's why both men kept the conversation private, because the fact that they talked at all was more important than what they said. The image of them together undermined the narrative that there was one right way to fight for freedom. It suggested complexity, multiplicity, a movement enough to hold both King and Malcolm, both nonviolence and self-defense, both love and rage. In 1999, 35 years after the meeting, a historian interviewing former aides from both camps pieced together the most detailed reconstruction of what was said. According to people who'd been close enough to hear fragments, the conversation went something like this. "Malcolm, Dr. King, they're going to kill both of us, you know. Martin, I know. But that's not a reason to stop. Malcolm, I'm not saying stop. I'm saying we should stop letting them make us enemies. Martin, we're not enemies, we're just different soldiers in the same war. Malcolm, then maybe we should stop shooting at each other and save the bullets for the real enemy. Martin, I don't shoot brother Malcolm, but I agree with the sentiment. Malcolm, you know what I mean. Martin, I do. This reconstruction is disputed. Some people present say they didn't hear anything like that. Others say it sounds about right. but even if it's accurate, it's fragments, a 60-second conversation reduced to a few lines. The full depth of what passed between them, the subtext, the understanding, the things communicated without words is lost, and maybe that's how they wanted it. Because some conversations are too important to be reduced to talking points, some understandings are too complex for public consumption, some respect is too private to perform. The tragedy of Malcolm and Martin dying so young is obvious. The movements they could have built, the alliances they could have formed, the evolution both were undergoing, cut short by violence. But there's another tragedy, smaller, more intimate. They only met once, 60 seconds, in a hallway, surrounded by cameras, with no privacy to really talk, no time to explore the common ground they were both moving toward, no opportunity to discover if they could have worked together, or if their differences were unbridgeable. We'll never know, because 1 year after that meeting, Malcolm was dead. 4 years later, Martin was dead. And the conversation they might have had, the deep, hours-long private conversation where they could have debated, disagreed, found synthesis, never happened. All we have is 60 seconds, a photograph, and two men who chose to keep whatever understanding they reached private. Maybe that's the point, not the content of the conversation, but the fact that they had it. Not what they said, but that they said it in private. Not the answers they found, but the questions they were willing to ask each other. In a world that wanted them to be enemies, they chose to be something else. Not friends necessarily, but men who saw each other, respected each other, and understood that the fight for black liberation was big enough to include both of them. That's the legacy of the 60 seconds, not the words, the recognition, and the choice to protect something sacred by keeping it private. Some truths are too important to share. Some conversations are too meaningful to explain. Some meetings change everything without anyone knowing exactly how. March 26, 1964, Capitol hallway, two Titans, 60 seconds, and a silence that speaks louder than any speech either man ever gave.